All right. Well, let's take a look. There it is, the apple. Who here has had an apple today, which keeps the doctor away? I haven't had my apple yet today. Has anyone had an apple yet? Okay, you're supposed to eat an apple a day. It's good fiber too. But anyway, I have some apples down in the kitchen. I need to eat some, but our family eats a lot of apples, so I'm a banana guy myself. But anyway, okay. Well, this topic is certainly a long one, plenty to cover. I'm not going to be able to cover every single aspect of it tonight. Does anybody remember the song "Original Sin" by INXS in the '80s? Is anyone an '80s guy here like I am? Australian band INXS. They had a song called "Original Sin." It was a great song, great band. I went to see them in concert twice. Then the lead singer took his life in 1991, and then they went on from there. Then eventually they found a new lead singer. Then they eventually broke up. Well, anyway, if you're in '80s music like I was, because I was kind of doing my hedonistic thing at that point, teenager, this was a great song. So go listen to it on your own. You can just Google it on your phone and listen away. Anyway, so who cares about that? Because none of you are from Australia, and even if you are, it wouldn't matter. But you could be from the States and remember them. They're a pretty big band. All right, so what I want to mention is that there are some debates over the historicity of Adam that have been going on a long time and within the scholarly world and science and New Testament studies. I don't have time to cover all that because that's not what this topic is about. That's a topic for another time, which we could do. But if you want to get some books to read about that, how Adam fits into not only our theology, but also contemporary science, how does it work with a pair of two people, an existing pair in light of, what we know about population genetics and things like that. You can get some of these books. There's more out there, but these are just some to start on. So you can go for it if you want. I'm not going to be talking about that tonight, though. And that's another good book that's come out by a computational biologist here. It's called The Genealogical Adam and Eve. It's kind of interesting. So you can get that book by him. He has a lot of videos as well. I mean, not everybody agrees with him, but he certainly has created a plausible case for historical Adam and Eve within the what we knew about the evolutionary science. And some of you may say, well, I don't care about that. I care what the Bible says. Well, that's fine. But once you get out of contemporary culture, you start debating these issues. You have to know these things. So you can't really just sweep them away because people start asking those questions. Okay. And then, of course, I'm also not going to be debating historicity of Genesis. That's another topic I've done in another meeting, another Zoom call, which you can go look on my YouTube channel. We talked about some of that stuff another time, but you can get some of these books if you want to look at Genesis, some of the issues with that. Okay. There's been a slew of books that have been written about Genesis. Okay. So I just want to cover those two issues, get them out of the way. But if you want to get into the topic of original sin, these are probably three good starting points. If you want to go deeper on the topic, this book in the middle is the most current book that's come out over the last year. The gray covered one here came out quite a long time ago, but it's still a good book. I think the new edition came out in the 90s, but the updated edition. And then the Against God and Nature book on the far right's fairly recent. I mean, over the last, I think 5 to 8 years or so. So that's fairly new. So anyway, if you just want to go deeper on that, you care about these topics or this topic, you can read away, whatever. I don't care, whatever you want to do. Well, there's no doubt that as we look around the world, we've always asked, hopefully or at some point we've said, there seems to be something very wrong with the human condition. Something is wrong or off about humans, the things we do, our behavior, our actions. You could even, if you watch the news on a daily basis, it's fairly depressing half the time. There's no doubt about it. It's kind of depressing. Some of the things that happen to people, some of the things you just scratch your head and go, I just can't believe it. But that's been going on in humanity for a long time. Problem with what we do, our actions are not something that we know something's wrong. Something's off about the humanity. So that's obviously a topic that probably most of us have questioned at some point. If you haven't, then I don't know how you even be able to exist, because humans, there's a lot of news, a lot of things you've probably seen. You just go, oh, what is that? It's funny when we ask people on our campus ministry, are you a good person? We do get a lot of yeses. And of course, the question back to them always is, well, what's your standard for being a good person? Because you can't answer the question until you define what good is. If you don't have a standard for goodness, then there's no way to answer the question. I mean, is your standard of being a good person come from society? Does it come from yourself? Is it purely subjective? Does it come from your friends? Or does it come from an outside source such as God? I mean, do you get your standard of being a good person from God? And of course, a lot of people have to think about that when they answer this question, because it depends on how you define the good, right? That's the key to the question. So this question is always used to point people back to the gospel, because obviously nobody is good enough to meet the standard of God, right? And so that's why we need a savior. But anyway, so that's just something that's kind of interesting. Some people blame what's wrong with human behavior on things such as genetics. We know that people talk about my genes made me do it, or is my upbringing. It's due to psychology. It's due to a mental defect or something like that, or just my social environment. Those things certainly play a role in our behavior. I'm not discounting them at all, because they're there. But the question is that going to be enough to explain the human condition and all the things that have happened throughout humanity? I mean, can you blame it all on these things? Can you go back to these as its starting places? And I think we find that there's probably we have a different explanation. Not that these things don't play a role, but there's a much larger explanation. And I think that we all hopefully agree that the doctrine of original sin is empirically verifiable throughout history when we study humanity across civilizations, and in our own personal experience, across the board, just all across different places, that we see something is off about humans. I mean, the way we've treated each other, the atrocities, the genocides, the other issues, the just list goes on and on and on. So, it seems like there's no problem in empirically verifying the universality of the impact of sin in our world, just over history. Okay, if you don't think it's there, then obviously you haven't been living in reality, or else you don't study history. Just let alone think of the Holocaust. Some of us say, well, how could he do that to those people? How could Hitler do that? What's wrong with him? Well, it's this sociological reason, or this reason, or that reason. Well, those things are interesting, and I'm sure they're relevant, but there's a deeper problem that we're talking about here. Okay, so if you go back to the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2, I want to emphasize that it describes the goodness of God's creation, which is the epitome of God's creative work. And so we have to understand, when God created us in his image, that God said it was good when he created. Like, he created us, it's a good thing. I mean, it's not, it's the pinnacle of God's creation. We are, the epitome of his handiwork. And so, but the point is that he created it and said it was good, as far as like, when God created. So he didn't create it and say it's just bad, right? So we want to make sure we understand that. When we go on to Genesis 3 and we see what happens when it talks describing the fall, we call it the fall, from the perfect relationship that Adam and Eve have with their creator. It's true the Bible doesn't use language like fall of man or the fall. Okay, that's a theological phrase we use. There's all kinds of theological phrases we use to describe things in the Bible, so it's really no big deal. Well, it's not mentioned in the Bible. Who cares? Okay, it's just something we use. Okay, in our language, we don't use the word Trinity's not in the Bible. Incarnation's not in the Bible. I could go on the list. There's so many words we use in theology that aren't in the Bible, but we use them. Okay, so I'm not concerned about that. The question is whether it's biblical, right? Okay, and then after the sin, with Adam and Eve, they hide from God, of course, and we see that the relationship between them was damaged, because then we have the first family argument, the very first family argument That's why if you're on this call and you're married or you've been in a relationship, all your arguments can be traced back to this one thing. You can blame it on them. When you get in an argument with your wife or your other, you say, darn, they blew it in the garden and that's why we're having this argument tonight. It's not our fault, right? That's what you say every time. You blame Adam and Eve, right? Darn them. They just couldn't do it right. Anyway. But like I said, I just want to emphasize that Genesis 1 and 2, as they come before Genesis 3, human nature was created and pronounced good by God. Okay, it was pronounced good, but of course it's been corrupted now. But we are still created in the image of God. Unbelievers who don't believe in Jesus still have God's image on them. That means that they still have something good created in them, right? There's not like nothing good about them at all. Okay, so we don't want to say that there's not one good thing about man. Nothing good, period. Well, as far as like them being able to attain salvation, I agree there's nothing they can do, right? I mean, there's no good work we can do, but you don't want to say that everything about human beings are just completely corrupt to the point that they have nothing good left. That's not biblically true, as I'll show. It is true that sin, which isn't it's not intrinsic to our nature, it has internally damaged us and corrupted us, right? So we're off track. But the point is that we still have God's image on us. We're still created in the image of God. We still are created in the image of a moral being. And we still have the moral law written on our hearts, which I'll talk about later on from Romans 2. So we can still do some good things as humans do, right? Okay, I mean, obviously, before I was a believer, I could still do a lot of good things. I could feed the homeless. I could, help the old lady across the road. I could, this is all kinds of things I could still do, consider to be good. But the point is that, we don't want to just say that there's nothing good humans can do. Of course, when it comes to salvation, yes, that's true. We can't do anything good enough to earn our salvation. I'm well aware of that. Okay, so the question is, now the other thing is that if human nature is totally corrupted, if you think about this, if it is totally corrupted, then how could Jesus have a divine and human nature? Because Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, the Son. He's the only one that has an additional human nature. The Father never took on a human nature, and the Holy Spirit never took on a human nature. Jesus is the only one that took on a human nature, as he already had the divine nature, but he then added the human nature, or the human nature was added. Now, of course, we believe that Jesus was virgin born, so that helped escape the corruption, if you want to say, coming into world through a fallen woman. Of course, I don't believe Mary was sinless, like some people believe. I don't think that's biblical. I haven't seen any evidence for it. But the point is that you'd have to ask yourself, if human nature is totally corrupted, then how could Jesus have both a divine and human nature, right? Just something to think about, okay? Now, one thing that happened from the fall is that there's a word called shalom that we're probably familiar with, at least I hope so, which means peace, harmony, wholeness, completeness, prosperity, harmony between people, nations, God. We all desire, hopefully, to have shalom in our lives. We can have peace with ourselves. We have that wholeness. We have, of course, completeness with God, the wholeness with God when we come to know the Messiah. We can hopefully have shalom with other humans, with relationships with our friends, family. Hopefully, we strive to build relationships of shalom. But, of course, from the fall of man, the shalom is now lacking. There's problems in attaining that. Because of what happened, we now have problems with relationships. We have a shame and regret problem. Our relationships with others damaged, sometimes with blame and argument. And of course, our relationship with God has changed from intimacy to alienation. And so we as humans are alienated from God, right? We are alienated from him. And we don't have the shalom with him that he wanted, or that it's gone from what he originally wanted. That's why we need the Messiah coming into the world to fix that problem. So as we move forward here, perhaps some of us are saying, well, how, can we talk more about that topic of, why would God allow, the fall of man, and why did he allow all this if he knew they were going to sin, and why'd he create the world anyway? God knows everything. So why'd he create a world the way he did when he knew Adam would fall, and all these things would be off about the world from then on. And we'd have to go through all the suffering, misery, and all this stuff. Well, I'm not going to have time to go into that. I talked about that in another Zoom call a little bit, but you may want to pick up Alvin Plantinga's Nature of Necessity. It came out a long time ago, but he talks about something called trans-world depravity. And that means that basically when God looks at all the possible worlds he could have created, that's different scenarios. It may be that God might actually, remember, God can't do everything. Omnipotence only means the power to effect change. God can't create a square circle. He can't lie. He can't violate his own nature, right? So it doesn't mean all powerful means he can do anything like violate his own nature. No, that's not what that means. So the point is that he might not be able to create a world in which free creatures always go right and never morally wrong. That without free creatures that have the ability to choose what is right and avoid what is wrong, can he create a world basically where all humans are determined what to do ahead of time? That may not be possible because without the freedom and love component, that isn't really true. Or without the freedom, there is no love. They go together. So it may not just be any world out there that God could do where he could just create a world where everyone's determined without having the freedom and love component. So if you want to go into that deeper, get Plantinga's book there. I don't have time to go into that. That's a possibility to explain that, but I don't have the time to go into all the possibilities there. And at this point, there's been 100 possible solutions and all these different scenarios for theodicies or that issue. But anyway, now there's three kinds of death that came from the fall of when this happened. There's definitely spiritual death. We know that Adam and Eve began to die spiritually the moment they died. We know that death is separation from God. It's alienation from God. We know Adam experienced spiritual isolation when he began to hide. We see his shame and hiding. And of course, eventually this leads to the second death. In Revelation, it talks about that there. We will die the second death. And we die physically, right? Our bodies break down. Our bodies begin to degenerate. And also the creation is off. The creation's moaning and groaning for renewal, as Paul talks about in Romans. So there's consequences, right? Consequences to what happened. Now, there's a couple of definitions of sin by a couple theologians I'm using here. Well, one's kind of a mix of the two, or maybe a biblical scholar and theologian, but there's a couple, definitions here that may be helpful, and you probably mostly agree with, I think. So Wayne Grudem wrote the giant book, Systematic Theology. It's been used in every pastor's library for the last 20 years. He just wrote the newest edition. He says here, sin is any failure to conform the moral law of God in act, attitude, and nature. Sin is here defined in relation to God and his moral law. Sin includes not only individual acts such as stealing or lying or committing murder, but also attitudes that are contrary to the attributes, the attitudes God requires of us. The late J.I. Packer, who passed away last year, the great Puritan theologian, who I read his book. If you ever read his book, Knowing God, you should read his book, Knowing God. It's a masterpiece. He says, sin may be comprehensively defines a lack of conformity to the law of God in act, habit, attitude, outlook, disposition, motivation, mode of existence. That's both pretty decent definitions. Grudem goes on to say, in a universe created by God, sin ought not to be. Sin is directly opposite to all that is good in the character of God, just as God necessarily eternally delights in himself and all that he is, so God necessarily and eternally hates sin. It is, in essence, the contradiction of the excellence of his moral character. It contradicts his holiness, and he must hate it. So one thing for sure, we see the impact of sin. We see that every part of the human being seems to be affected by sin. Our intellects, our emotions, our desires, our hearts. The heart, of course, is the center of who we are. It's the totality of everything, includes our intellect, emotion, will. So that's basically the same thing. It impacts our decision-making process, our goals, motives, and of course, it impacts our physical bodies. if you make decisions, sinful decisions, sometimes, of course, it does impact you physically. It can hurt you physically, right? It hurts your cognition. It throws off your emotions. So sin definitely impacts. We're holistic beings, and it impacts all of us. Now, when we say the phrase total depravity, perhaps you're familiar with that. That, sometimes it's a phrase we use. Are humans like totally depraved? What that really means is that, sin and its influence impacts the whole person. It's not just like part of us, it impacts all of us. But it does not mean, as I say, number 2 here, that man is without a conscience or any sense of right or wrong. It doesn't mean that we have no ability to do good anymore. We have no ability to do the right thing ever. That's not what that means, okay? It does mean, I would agree that humans have no ability to save themselves. Like they can't give themselves new life. Like they can't create, salvation for themselves. I would agree. There's nothing we can do to generate that. But definitely, we don't want to get the idea when we say humans are depraved. When I look out and I see bad things happen in the culture, like I see people do really, really horrible things, like whether it be murders or whatever, child molestation, I don't know, something, something gets your attention. You say, oh, the depravity of man. I'll say, oh, depravity, such depravity, But I do know when I look out in the culture and I read stories, I do see things do amazing things for other humans. Sometimes they can do really amazing moral things. So, God's image is still in them, right? Like I said before, the image of God is still imprinted on them. They have the moral law in their hearts, and they still can do some good things. So total depravity doesn't mean humans cannot do anything. Okay, good. But it definitely means they cannot save themselves. Okay, they can't give themselves salvation, right? They can't generate that. Alvin Plantinga also, he builds on this. There's something we kind of, as a sidebar, we talk about something called the noetic effects of sin. That's the sin on the mind, how it impacts your cognition. Alvin Plantinga is the guy I mentioned before in that book. He's a Christian philosopher. He says, it should be on the one hand, sin carries with it a sort of blindness, a sort of imperceptiveness, dullness, stupidity. This is a cognitive limitation. It first of all prevents its victim from proper knowledge of God and his beauty, glory, and love. It also prevents him from seeing what is worth loving and what worth hating, what should be sought, and etc. And therefore compromises both knowledge of fact and knowledge of value. So sometimes we say, like theologians say, like the noetic effects of sin, we're talking about the impacts of sin on our cognition, that we're not able to, our cognition's off when we're trying to perceive God's existence. That's why, like Romans 1, when Paul talks about, they look at the creation, then they turn away from it and they reject it. They're turning away from it, because of the impact of sin, and they want to do what they want to do, and then God judges them for the idolatry. But there is some cognitive damage from the fall, definitely. I would agree with that. Now, when it comes to defining original sin, yes, the phrase is not in the Bible. Again, the Bible doesn't use the phrase original sin. But, some people use that phrase, talking about where it came from, like where did it start at? What's the origin of sin? That's, of course, Augustine talked about this. But, some people say it can mean sin originated with Adam. Some people, they might say inherited guilt, inherited sin, original guilt, original pollution. There's all these different phrases that people use. At the end of the day, I don't know if it really matters one way or the other. We're just trying to get a starting point for sin, so if you want to say original sin, I don't care. But the point is that I'm well aware the phrase isn't in the Bible, but we're just trying to find a starting point for it. By the way, did you notice that actually the garden account was not the first sin, right? Actually, the Bible talks about the fall of Lucifer, right, as the first rebellion and the first sin. If you read these passages, right, there was a demonic rebellion, of course, right? So technically, there was a rebellion before the rebellion in the fall, right? Just wanted to throw that out there before we, jump too far ahead. Just remember that. If you're asking me, It apparently seems to be that God gave Satan free will as well, because he rebelled, and angels have free will to rebel, and they rebelled. And so now we have fallen angels in the world, right? We have good angels and we have fallen angels, right? Now, when we talk about whether we have a sin nature, I think that when we say nature, we're talking about like the essence of who we are. The essence of who we are as persons, our nature. Like when we say God's nature, we talk about God having metaphysical or non-moral attributes and moral attributes. God is omnibenevolent or omnipresent, omnipotent, all those things. Those are God's attributes. But when we talk about, or his moral attributes, well, he's truthful, loving, just, those things. But we talk about God's nature, what he is. He's a triune being. He is biblically, right? He's one God, but he's triune. Now, if you ask me how I know that, I only know what God's nature is because he shows us. I don't know what God's like unless he reveals it. And he's revealed it through the world of nature and through the world of history in a text. And that's where you have the Bible. I only know God's triune by reading the Bible, right? He's a triune being. So, but that's a topic for another time. But the point is that our nature is the essence of who we are. Now, do we come in the world through a sin with a sin nature? We'll talk about that. You know, Paul says, while we're yet sinners, the Messiah died for us. You know, he says in Ephesians 2:3, by nature, we were children of wrath like the rest of mankind. So, you know, is it possible by nature points to something inborn original as distinguished what is subsequently acquired, like it's later on? That's where part of the debate is. And I don't know how much it matters anyway, but we'll talk about it. You know, the big passage we use is Romans 5 to talk about, there's not a lot of passages really. The big one is Romans 5. And Paul talks about the relation between Adam and humans. And, you know, he says here, I'm going to use the Net translation because I like that translation because Daniel Wallace is a Greek scholar, says this is the best English translation. So I'm doing what Daniel Wallace says. But he says there, so then just as sin entered the world through one man, death through sin, and so death spread to all people because all sin. For before the law was given, sin was in the world, but there's no accounting for sin where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who did not sin the same way that Adam, who is a type of the coming one, transgressed. But the gracious gift is not like the transgression, for if many died through the transgression of the one man, how much more did the grace of God and the gift by the grace of one man, Jesus, the Messiah Christ, multiply to the many? And the gift is not like the one who sinned, for judgment resulting in one's transgression led to condemnation, but the gracious gift from the many failures led to justification. For if by the transgression of the one man death reigned through the one, how much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness reign in life through one Jesus Christ? So that's the big text people look at when they try to figure out original sin, at least one of the big texts they use. You know, Paul has this this relationship. He obviously keeps talking about Adam, how Adam is the first man is Adam, the second Adam is Jesus is like, he's contrasting Adam and Jesus. You know, Adam does this and then Jesus does this. You know, Adam sins, the trespass comes, Jesus does this, he fixes it. There's this contrast there. You know, even in 1 Corinthians 15:22, he does that. He says, for as in all Adam will die, so in Christ will be made alive. So there's a lot going on there between the relationship between what Adam did and what Jesus did. Okay, the contrast there. You'd have to study that passage more. But you notice how he says here, it's interesting. Paul says, so then, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, so death spread to all people because all sinned. For before the law was given, sin was in the world. And that's interesting. He's saying before the Torah was given, that's what the law is, Torah. That's the law of Moses, right? It's Sinai, the Torah. He said, before the law was given, sin was in the world, but there's no accounting for sin where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam until Moses, even though those who did not sin, in the same way that Adam, who is a type of the coming one, transgressed. So the question is, you know, some would say when he says all men sin, can mean that even though we weren't there historically with Adam when he sinned, we're actually identified in that event, that we are viewed as having sinned in the same incident, even though we didn't do it, Adam did it, right? That's why some people think they think that's what Paul is saying. But notice how he says here, sin was in the world before the Torah, the law was given, but sin is not counted. There is no law, yet death reigned from Adam until Moses, etc., etc., etc. So he's saying from the time of Adam to Moses, right? Before Moses got the Torah or the law, sinners, their sins were not counted, but they still died. It's interesting. But it's interesting. So, the fact they died, it showed that, God seems to still hold them accountable for sin, even before the law is given at Sinai. That's interesting. They're holding them accountable based on what Adam did. It's kind of interesting. But there's so much more to that passage, obviously, that we're going to get into. The problem we get into is the Romans 5 passage is, what's the connection between Adam and us? Okay, is Paul saying that Adam's sin is somehow transferred to us, whether we like it or not? Does that mean that I'm born into the world? When I come into the world, do I have this sin nature? Do I have this sin nature that I'm born with? I come out of my mother's womb. I have this sin nature, and that's just the way it is because I inherited it. My parents inherited it, and their parents inherited it. Just goes back and back and back, tracing it back to Adam. Okay? And so the problem becomes how people try to connect Adam and humans. And there's been a lot of views on this, a lot of debated views. One view that's been viewed as heretical by Reformed theologians is Pelagianism, and they said that Adam's sin didn't affect future generations of humanity. Basically, that Adam's sin was his own. Adam's descendants do not inherit a sinful nature passed on to them. It's named after a monk named Pelagius. And so that's been frowned upon by Reformed theology for a long time. And so that was one view, that what Adam did has no connection to us. That was Adam's sin. He did that. And it doesn't carry on to our lives. There's no relationship between the two. And then we come into what we call the Reformed view. This is the traditional view that most Christians have, even though they may not know it or not know it. But if you come from a Reformed theology background, which is a lot of Christians have that background. I was not discipled in a Reformed theology background. I've read a little bit on it, but I'm not Catholic. So obviously I have to agree with some things about the Reformation because I'm not Catholic, but I'm not dogmatic as saying I'm Reformed. I don't call myself like a Reformed Christian. Okay. But the point is that the traditional Reformed view is there's something we call imputed righteousness. And that means that Adam's sin was imputed to us, meaning that the legal guilt is imputed to us. It's transferred to us. But what Jesus does is he gives us what's called imputed righteousness. So God imputes Jesus' righteousness. He applies Jesus's righteousness to us, right? So we've been clothed by the imputation of Jesus, the transfer of the righteousness of Jesus is onto us now by faith. So just like there's imputed legal guilt from Adam, we are infused with imputed righteousness from what Jesus has done. That's kind of like the standard traditional Reformed view of justification, what it is. And that's what a lot of Christians believe. And they have some arguments for that, obviously. And then that kind of ties in a little bit with what's called the Federalism View, or what we call representational view, where Adam, just like a president is the head of a country, like he's viewed as like, if a president goes to a different country and he says, if Joe Biden goes to Russia and he says, I am the United States. Well, he doesn't mean he's literally the United States. The United States consists of people. He's saying, I am the representative of the United States. Or like Putin says, I am Russia. The list goes on of leaders of different countries. So there's something we call corporate solidarity where the one represents the many. And so Adam would be viewed as, in this view, Adam's like our federal head. He's like the head of humanity. Okay, he's been designated that. And so we're guilty virtually because of what he did. Just like, in a way, we can be held accountable. We can face the consequences of a leader's decisions, like in our country or somewhere else, right? Someone can make a decision and it can impact the whole, the many, right? Even though it's one representative, right? So we are, in this view, we're condemned because Adam stood in for us as the representative of the human race due to his relationship to us as our federal head, okay, as our legally appointed representative. So we receive that that guilt, okay, because of what he did. Now, some people, of course, push back and say that's not fair. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. Adam did it. Just like, you might say, well, the leader of our country made a mistake. He did it. He's responsible. I'm not responsible for it, even though I face the consequences. A couple things about that. A Reformed view would say, you may object to being blamed for Adam's actions, but then you'd have to object to being credited with Christ's actions, right? What he did, right? You don't want to do that. So we don't really have a problem being found righteous in which the Messiah has done. We don't have a problem accepting the righteousness of Christ, right, being applied to us. It's just the problem with Adam's guilt. We seem to have a problem with that. So you can't have one without the other. That's what they would say. That would be the reasoning behind that, whether you agree or disagree. Now, the problem is some of the criticisms of this view. It's hard there seems to be a challenge of getting the exact connection between Adam's sin and us. Like how is what Adam did connected to us directly? Does Paul talk about that in Romans 5? Does he say, this is how Adam's sin is transferred to us? Do we actually know for sure? Well, some would say it's not clear as it should be. Maybe our deeply sinful condition should be more understood as like a damage consequence rather than guilt reckoned to us. That's just different language. And then the problem is that if everyone is just, if humans are born with a sin nature and we're guilty before God coming into the world out of our mom's womb, then you'd have to look at infants as being born guilty, mentally handicapped people that can't understand the gospel. Are they condemned automatically because they exist? And then you get in those issues of, that's why some traditions say, but babies have to be baptized, and that fixes the problem, which it doesn't. But at the end of the day, I'm not worried about infants anyway. I think God covers them regardless, but that's a debate for another time. It doesn't talk about that in the Bible anyway, what happens to infants in that state. But the point is that this is one of the criticisms that comes up sometimes of the Reform view. In another way, maybe a critic might reword it. They might say, well, look, perhaps we have propensities towards sin, but we still come in the world untainted. But we already have that disposition. We're still going to have that disposition at some point to sin. Eventually, we will actualize the sin. We have a potential to sin. The potentiality is there always. And then we actualize it at some point. Like I told you guys last week, probably the first sin I remember doing as a young child was age 4. I stole a pack of Lifesavers in a drugstore. My conscience bothered me. 2 hours later, I walked up to my dad and showed it to him. He took me back to the drugstore, made me walk up in the front, show it to the cashier in front of everybody, and hand it back to them. I was totally embarrassed. I cried all the way to the car, but that got my attention to not to do that again. So anyway, and I never stole one thing again the rest of my life, ever again. But anyway, so that's the way someone would kind of criticize the Reform view and say, well, I'm not really sure there's good evidence that we're born into the world with like a sin nature. Maybe that's hard to kind of get the exact connection between Adam and humans precisely. But it's obvious that humans have a propensity to sin, a disposition to sin. Eventually, we're going to sin anyway. So yes, we sin, even though if we don't know how the organic connection happens between Adam and humans. Okay, that's how one person might respond to that as a critic. Then we have this guy that came along, famous church writer, famous, theologian, wrote City of God Confessions, famous theologian, philosopher, bishop. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's pretty well known in Christian theology. But he kind of had the view that's impacted a lot of people's views on original sin. He didn't he's not the one that basically came up with the entire doctrine, but he certainly had a role in it. I mean, he said basically similarity to what the Reform view is. Because of the sin of Adam, the rest of the human race participated in that sin. And because of our solidarity with Adam, we're guilty as well. So we're subject to the same penalty, okay? And it's transmitted to us, obviously. Now how it's transmitted, once again, is it open for debate, how that sin be transmitted to us. Some people think that it's transmitted through the parents. I mean, there's no other way. We come out of the womb, out of our parents' womb, it's transmitted from them to us. That's how it's passed on from generations, but that's a debate for another time. But the point is that he certainly played a role in thinking about original sin and played a role in relation to the Reform view. One thing we don't want to do, though, just a little reminder. Whenever you're looking about beliefs, the things that we believe, like our theological beliefs, you never want to completely reject something based on the origin of it, okay, or the source of it, because you always have to look to the whatever the person's claiming, whatever century. If they say this is what the Bible teaches, whether it's 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, I guess 16th century. I mean, 16th century is the Reformation, and I'm thinking to myself, boy, that's way beyond the Bible times. I mean, some of the stuff they're saying that are biblical, but I still have to look at the truth value of what they're saying, whether it matches with the Bible, right? Just like the Trinity, the creedal formulation of the Trinity wasn't until much later, several centuries, the creedal formulation. But that doesn't mean the Trinity's not in the Bible. That doesn't mean the starting point for it is in the Bible and the evidence for it is in the Bible. The question is whether the creeds they come up with match with the biblical teaching, right? So you don't want to just reject something just based on the dating, okay, or when the person came up with that, okay? Just that's something to remember. Look at the truth value of it, what they're saying. Is there evidence for what they're saying? Now, what about Judaism? Most of the rabbis will say they reject original sin and all the rabbinical literature. Remember, there's no rabbinic Judaism in the Bible, right? Rabbinic Judaism is something that starts after the time of Jesus, right? After the temple's destroyed, 70 AD. And a lot of the Judaism that's followed today is tied in with rabbinic Judaism as like its authority. So just off the bat, I'm not going to probably agree with some of the things rabbinic Judaism says. I don't. I've studied some of the things rabbinic Judaism says. I don't agree with them. Because a lot of it's based on the oral Torah, and I don't think the oral Torah is a revelation from God anyway. The written Torah is, but not the oral Torah. It's not the oral Torah is irrelevant, but it's not, I don't think it's God-inspired, God-breathed like the written Torah is. But anyway, in rabbinic doctrine, they do believe every human being has two inclinations. They pull against each other. These are called the good inclination and the evil inclination, okay? And it sounds kind of similar to original sin, or somewhat like the flesh battling the spirit in some ways. So we have a propensity to do evil, a propensity to do good. It's kind of interesting. So it's not, they don't call it original sin, but it sounds in some ways not too far away from Christian teaching, not like drastic gaps away or drastic, a huge gap. Now, there's an article, I don't have time to go into it. If you want to read this article by Stanley Porter, it's called The Pauline Concept of Original Sin in Light of Rabbinic Doctrine. You can read that, type that in online, you can read it. I think he found in his studies that Paul is not borrowing from a rabbinic doctrine on sin. Okay, Paul's not borrowing. Paul's view of sin is different from the evil inclination, the good inclination, or any rabbinic teaching there. I think you'll find that, okay? So you can read that on your own. Now, what about that passage in Psalm 51? That people quote, David says, surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. So some people might read that and say, well, David is talking about inheriting sin, inheriting like a sin nature from his mom. He came out of the womb as a sinner. It's kind of debatable because the Psalms are poetic, right? They teach a lot about human feelings, David talks about utter uncleanliness, in Psalm 51 and how to pray. I don't know if you can't really take that verse and make an entire doctrinal statement about original sin. I don't think you can do that. I'm not even sure if that's, what David's doing there. Like he's saying, he's definitely not saying, okay, here it is. This is original sin. It's what it is. I have it from Psalm 51. I think that you have to look at the genre of Psalms, and that's more poetry. I just don't know if that can be used as a proof text or not to speak dogmatically about original sin. Now let's look at some texts in Jewish literature that talk about original sin. Now these texts are not canonical, meaning they are not in our canon, okay? But they were read by Jews, and There's no doubt that, we still have to see what they say. And I don't think you could say that there's no Jewish text anywhere that talks about original sin. I don't think you're going to see that here. Let's look at this one. 4th Ezra, written in AD 70, talks about Adam, the transgression, and death. This is 4th Ezra, chapter 3, verses 4 to 7. It says, O sovereign Lord, did you speak at the beginning when you formed the dust and gave it to you, Adam, a lifeless body, yet he was the workmanship of your hands? And you breathed into him the breath life, and he was made alive in your presence, and you led him into the garden, which your right hand had planted before the earth appeared, and you laid upon him one commandment of yours, but he transgressed it, and immediately appointed death for him and his descendants. Gee, that sounds like Romans 5 a little bit, doesn't it? 4th Ezra 3. Sounds a little bit like Romans 5, I'd say. How about 4th Ezra chapter 7? It says here, this is my first and last word. It'd be better if the earth had not been produced, Adam, or else when it produced him, had restrained him from sinning. For what good is it to all they live in sorrow now and expect punishment after death? O Adam, what have you done? For though it was you who sinned, the fall was not yours alone, but ours also, who are your descendants. Huh. That sounds a little bit like Romans 5 again. A little bit. Then we have one in 2nd Baruch, chapter 48. Verses 42 to 46, written after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Says here, O Adam, what did you do to all who were born after you? And what will be said of the first Eve who obeyed the serpent, so that this whole multitude is going to corruption? And countless are those who the fire devours. But again, I shall speak before you. You, O Lord, or my Lord, you know which is in your creation. For you command the dust one day to produce Adam. And you knew the number of those who were born from him and how they sinned before you, those who existed and who did not recognize you as your creator. Probably not as strong as the other two passages, the ones I just read before, about sounding a lot like Romans 5 or somewhat similar. This one here and the one before that. These first two sound a lot like or somewhat like Romans 5, so have some commonality with Romans 5, what Paul's talking about. So there are some passages in Jewish literature that do talk about something on the lines that Paul talks about Romans 5 with the view of sin. So we can't say that Judaism has no text whatsoever that speaks about this issue. That's just, I don't think that's true. Now, let's look at, I want to talk about, as we wrap this up, so I want to talk about this passage in Ephesians. Ephesians 2, 1-2, where Paul says, and you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you formerly walked, according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. Now, the context of this, Paul's writing to Gentiles, right? In Ephesians, that's his audience. They're not Jews, they're Gentiles. He talks about how they're excluded from the life of God. Gentiles are brought into the covenant. They were once, far away. They're made, they were outside the Commonwealth of Israel. We know the context of Ephesians, right? But the point is that Paul uses this text, and this is kind of viewed as the text that says that people basically cannot do anything to give themselves. Does it mean that people cannot do one thing to give themselves new life? They're dead in their sins. Just like, let's say I'm witnessing to somebody, I'm talking about the gospel. If I said to them, you're dead in your trespasses and sins. The Bible says that we're dead in sin. It's like, if I use an illustration, I said, it's like going to a funeral and knocking on a casket and people looking at you like you're completely crazy, because you'd say, that person's dead. They can't hear you. They can't respond. They're physically dead, right? And so kind of like Ephesians 2 is used kind of like, it's a view of like, well, it's like we're walking around dead people all day. Like dead people are dead to God, right? That's kind of what some people think. And so spiritually dead is generally referred to as the idea that, for unregenerate people without the Holy Spirit, the Ruach, that's a Hebrew word for spirit, are dead to spiritual things. Jesus said here, he said in John 3, he said that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of spirit is spirit. The spirit gives life, but the flesh counts for nothing. And that is why I told you, no one comes to him unless they're born again, unless God grants it. So we don't have the ability to to save ourselves, which is true. We need an infusion of new life through the Spirit. But I think sometimes the way this verse is read, well, let's read on here. Go on. But Paul talks about here in Titus 3:5, he says, "Not by works which we have done in righteousness, but according to his mercy, he saved us through the washing of regeneration and renewing the Holy Spirit." I talked about the Ephesians 2:5 text. We were dead in trespasses. He made us alive with Christ, or alive with the Messiah. Colossians 2:13, when you're dead in trespasses and uncircumcision of your sinful nature, God made you alive with the Messiah. So we need to be regenerated. That's what that means to be born again. We need new life, right? Now, the problem is that if we view it as, if you go back to the garden, if you think about when Adam and Eve sinned, the day, God said the day they ate of it, they would die. Well, does that mean at that time that they can no longer respond to God in any way after they ate the fruit and the sin entered the world? Does that mean they can't respond to God now? Now, it's interesting that you go on to read Genesis 3 when God asked them, "Where are you?" And then Adam, Adam was still able to hear God's voice and communicate with God. So if Adam was dead in his sin, if he's unable to respond to God, like most people think that's what dead in sin is, how was he able to respond to God at all in the garden account? So I think a better way of looking at Ephesians 2, that text, if we go back here, dead, you talk about being dead in trespasses and sins. Just stay with me here. We're almost done. I think what we want to view that as is being relationally separated from God. Obviously, Adam and Eve were severed in a relationship with God in the garden. Cain was severed his relation with God through his sins and willingness to repent. The prodigal son severed his relationship. So to be dead in sin, it means not to have a relationship with God, but it doesn't mean that an unbeliever cannot there's some things that unbelievers still knows about God, like they still can respond to creation. I respond to creation growing up, but I always believe God created the world, the light of creation. They could still respond to their conscience in some ways. But I would agree that their relationship with God is definitely, there's a separation, but it doesn't mean that they can't, it means they cannot understand anything about God. It means they can't do anything to save themselves, that's for sure. Because even though people are severed from God, a relationship right now, people like I know, you see every day. Paul says in Romans 2 that Gentiles who have the law by nature do what the law requires. They're a law themselves. And they show the work of the law written in their hearts. People who don't have a relationship with God, they're severed from God, can still have the moral law written on them, which they do, and they still can do some things that show that the moral law is there. For example, like I said before, like C.S. Lewis, when he wrote the book Abolition of Man, he looked across all cultures, and they all had these transcendent values, the same moral things that they all believed in. The law, this duty to parents, honoring your parents, your elders, your ancestors. They believe in justice, honesty, duties to children, posterity, the law of good faith and veracity, law of mercy. They had a lot of commonality across cultures. And Lewis thought that basically Paul's comment here in Romans 2 really bore witness to all the cultures he studied. The moral law is still there. So even though people are severed from relation with God, meaning that they're still they don't have salvation yet. I mean, they haven't been reconciled to God. They still have the moral law written in their hearts, and they can do some good. And when you think of a person who's relationally separated from someone like God, they don't want to spend time with them. They don't want to do anything to do with them. They go their own way. Sometimes, use the word death when you define a relationship like that. Some people say you're dead to me. That's a severed relationship, right? The relationship is severed. Okay. But for the same token, like I said, I think that we need to make sure that what I'm saying is I agree that Ephesians 2 does teach that nobody can say, I'm saying nobody can save themselves. They can't give themselves spiritual life. They can't create the new birth in them. The new birth has to happen. That's a work of the Holy Spirit. But it doesn't mean that people have the inability to do anything good. That's not what that means. They can still, the moral law is written on their hearts still, right? They can still do some good, but they certainly can't do enough good to save themselves, as I said at the beginning. Okay, so I think that, what we want to, in wrapping up, I think that if we go back to the beginning, I think that I'm not sure how much it really matters, how much we're able to connect, if we're able to say, well, I don't like saying the humans have a sin nature. I don't like saying we're born sinners because I don't know the organic connection between Adam and us. I mean, the Bible seems to say there's a relationship between Adam and us. I'm not really sure how it's connected, how the sin from Adam gets to humans. Or you say, well, I don't know, but all I know is humans sin at some level. Eventually we sin, and humans sin. We see it throughout history that sin's there. There's some sort of relationship between Adam and humans, okay? It's there. Whether you want, if you want to take this view, like I said back here, and say that where is that? The Pelagius, where is it? Yeah, that if you want to take that view, you can do that. Of course, that was viewed as heresy. But if the problem you're having is like some people say, well, that's just too damaging to humans. You're saying humans are all bad. You're just saying they're all bad from original sin. We're all terrible. I emphasize at the very beginning, I said it again at the very end, original sin does not mean the humans cannot do anything good. It does. God created humans. He said it was good, right? We're still creating the image and likeness of God. We can still do good. People still get good things after the fall. They can still do good things today. So original sin doesn't mean that humans can't do anything good, and total depravity doesn't mean and no humans can't do anything good. So if you're worried about self-esteem issues and people will be too damaged by the doctrine of original sin, I don't know what, that's something you'll have to figure out. I don't know. Now, on the other hand, the flip side, perhaps you're somebody that says, well, you know what? Darn it, original sin is there, and I have no problem with it. And I think that we have a sin nature, and it's evident in humans. And, I have no problem connecting Adam to humans. And I think that's what Paul's teaching. But one way or the other, we see the impact of sin in reality all around us, okay? And the answer is a relationship through the Messiah, right? So, those are some things to think about. Oh, by the way, one last thing I didn't mention about regeneration. I had a slide, but I didn't put it on here at the end. We talk about regeneration, the new birth, showing evidence. Let's talk about like showing some evidence of that. I really have regenerated. I've experienced the Holy Spirit. A great book to go through to kind of like go through a checklist of some way is 1 John. There's a lot of good things written in 1 John about the evidence of a someone who's really in the faith, someone who's a believer. Okay, I'm not going to say that's the only thing to look at, but it's certainly 1 John has a lot of things you can read there about that. Okay, just don't get caught up in 1 John. Sometimes people read that verse that says, "No one who's born of God sins ever." Again, there's a context to that whole thing too. So, excuse me. Anyway, that's all I have to share with that. Now we can have our long discussion, and you can tell we can talk about this topic that's so easy to discuss. And I'll turn off